in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to the program this week of Inside the News. This is program number 300. That's right, 300 weeks we have been together on this very program, and we want to thank you for joining us. That means we're well into our sixth year. Frank Vernuccio, he's in the top left, and we're glad to always welcome him. How you doing today, Frank?
Doing great. It's great to be with you.
And what state are you in this week?
The delightful state of New York, because the weather is finally warming up. We might even see 40 degrees sometime this week.
Or you might get rid of Cuomo. Well, that will be another whole D in that one. And Ben Brunson, he's in the bottom middle, and he's the author of the Falstaff, Enigma, and Esther, Sling. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing great, gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be with you once again.
You know, we have got some interesting words to share with you, and Ben has done a lot of research on hydroxychloroquine that got a real bad rap about a year ago. We're going to talk about that on this very program when we go inside the news. But let's start with some good news this week here, Frank, and just briefly talk about that. Schools are opening up, and the reason why I bring this up is that my grandson yesterday, for the first time in a year, actually got to darken the doors of a school, and he's in second grade, and he is so delighted to be back in school, Frank.
Well, of course, that is great news, but the distaff part of that news, if you will, is that tragedy of kids losing a year of school didn't have to happen at all. We saw the reaction of the Biden administration, which basically caved into the teachers union to keep schools closed longer than they had to. Before that, Democrat blue states kept schools closed far longer than they had to. This was ridiculous. It had no bearing in science whatsoever. When Ben talks about his research later on, we're going to see more and more how the left and the Democratic Party as a whole simply rejects science in every area.
Okay, we're not going to get into your Lancet study here yet, Ben, but just talk about the schools. It is a good thing, though, that kids are returning.
It's probably the single most important thing is to get schools open to return back to normalcy in this country. And especially for the working men and women of this country, for single parents, it is an absolute necessity to have public school systems available. For the elites who run Washington, D.C. and fret about this stuff in New York City, most of them have their kids in private schools. Most private schools have been open through most of this. They can afford nannies or whatever it takes to maintain a normal lifestyle. For the average person, public schools are essential. And we have been doing a horrible disservice. The data has been clear for a long, long time. There was some question last February, last March, maybe into April, but by May, the data was crystal clear that children were essentially unaffected by COVID-19, no different than the common flu in terms of potential fatalities. Yes, if millions of kids are exposed to anything, you're going to have one or two who die as a result. And that is a horrible thing. But that applies to just about everything that goes through a school system over the course of a year. And this has been the reality. And yet we have Democrats aligned with the public teachers' school unions to keep these schools shut down for an extended period. It's one of the great travesties and scandals in our nation's history, frankly.
All right. Frank, I want to jump to Ben on this next hydroxychloroquine segment, because that actually comes before what we were going to be talking about, that the coronavirus is just a blip, because there's going to be another big crisis on the horizon, and because the Democrats are going to keep building the crisis. But I just want you to kind of give a preface before we go to Ben. Frank?
Well, look, we're going to be talking about a financial crisis in the United States. The stimulus package was just passed by the Senate. It's going back to the House for reconciliation. And there is an illusion that somehow we can keep printing dollars and those dollars are still going to be worth something. Back in the 1920s, we had hyperinflation in Germany. And of course, the famous picture of the German uh, father going to the grocery store to get some groceries for his kids. He has a wheelbarrow full of marks, German currency. He gets to the grocery store. The grocer says, those dollars, those marks are worthless, but I'll take the wheelbarrow in exchange for some of your groceries. This nonsense of printing up trillions of dollars, spending trillions of dollars, and assuming that somehow it's not going to have a dire effect on the value of savings, on the value of investments, is absolutely insane. We are looking at a financial disaster, perhaps not today, but very soon, where the currency is going to be devalued to an almost ludicrously low point.
Okay, Ben, let's start there before we get to hydroxychloroquine. This stimulus bill is a very bad bill.
It's pork spending at its worst. It is the worst of Washington, D.C. Of course, the economy is starting to hum quite well, and that's unemployment is now at 6.2%. Before Donald Trump, a lot of economists considered that the full employment rate, that you really can't do much better than that. We're at 6.2%, and we still have two of our largest states semi-shut down, California and New York. They're on the verge of reopening despite the worst efforts of their respective governors. They're going to reopen nonetheless because you can't resist the reality of how many people have been vaccinated now. Over 90 million doses administered in this country. And our economy is going to have a great run throughout the course of this year. We're going to have great GDP numbers, great employment numbers. And yet, even with $1 trillion unspent from prior bills, emergency relief bills, and remember, we ran a massive deficit last year, a multi-trillion-dollar deficit, I think close to $4.5 trillion of deficit spending last year. We're going to pile on with this new pork spending, which makes no sense whatsoever. It's insanity. It throws out any vestige of valuing the U.S. dollar, because, as Frank said, all of this will have to be monetized. All of this debt must be monetized over time. You can do it to an extent that you monetize roughly 5% of your GDP a year due to covering GDP growth and the worldwide demand for the dollars, but we're going to far exceed that, and we're going to have inflation as a result.
All right, now,
Guy, if I could just jump in for 1 second, I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
But we're looking at a $1.9 trillion package. Now, it's being sold as being this great thing for the American people. You're going to get these dollars. If you make under $80,000 as an individual, you'll get $1,400. But I did a back of the envelope math on this. So little of this bill is really going towards actual stimulus payments. If indeed that $1.9 trillion went directly to Americans, each individual would get $5,937.50. So this is a bill which uses a veneer of direct payments to individuals as an excuse to send money, for example, to blue states which have been profligate and have overspent ridiculously. There's 7% of the bill is being used for COVID treatment, which means that the lion's share of this bill has nothing to do with COVID and everything to do with the Democratic Party wish list of paying back their governors and their state legislators, rewarding them for wasting money over the past decades.
And Frank, if I'm not mistaken, they've also put provisions in this bill to redo some of the election laws so that they can remain in power till God comes back.
Yeah, I mean, and on that point, between that and HR 1, which would codify the election irregularities of 2020, we're looking at something that is going to have an extraordinary effect in the coming years. I would never justify violence of any sort, but the impact on the psyche of a lot of Americans is going to be that an election cannot be won fairly anymore, that the Democrat left has jiggered a system in which they will always win. The reaction, I think, in many people's minds is that we've got to do something else to take back the country. Violence is always unacceptable, but you are inciting violence by bills like H.R. 1 and the like, which codify election irregularities and, frankly, election cheating.
I think I can speak for Ben. We're going to take a vote on this, but you need a 2/3 vote to impeach you on this program, and you're not going to get it because you have 2/3 that's going to say we're going to keep him. What do you think, Ben?
I vote aye.
Yeah. Now the aye is to keep you, not to impeach you.
Yes.
So, all right, we're just going to basically touch the surface of this, but we're going to go back and forth on this as well because Frank's got some great input on this. But Ben, hydroxychloroquine, a year ago, that was touted as maybe something that could actually help, and because of Trump, their hatred of Trump far exceeded reality of science. Go, Ben.
Yeah, unfortunately for science, the largest voice in favor of hydroxychloroquine usage was Donald Trump's, and that led to a backlash. But there are two great prestigious journals, medicine journals, the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet. On May 22nd last year, Lancet published a study purported to involve 96,000 subjects on a global basis. And it looked at the usage of hydroxychloroquine in COVID cases, and it concluded that it increased the risk of death when used in treating COVID patients. The study had profound impact on the narrative in this country. It caused the World Health Organization to cancel a number of ongoing clinical studies that were underway globally involving hydroxychloroquine, HCQ as it's called. The World Health Organization changed its entire approach to the use of HCQ because of this study. The study, it turns out, was retracted just weeks later on June 4th by Lancet because the data, as it turns out, was completely fabricated. All of the data came from a company called Surgisphere based in Chicago area, owned by a Dr. Desai. Surgisphere had a handful of employees. It turns out in the aftermath that Surgisphere had no access to any of this data on a global basis that it claimed. It had a contract with a single hospital, even though the data claimed to come from 671 hospitals around the world. This study even had a quite prestigious, Mandeep Para, quite prestigious Harvard professor as the lead author, and yet somehow it got through the process at Lancet and got published. It never should have seen the light of day. The most cursory review by peers would have revealed that this data made no sense, but all of that was done after it was published by Lancet. It never should have happened. This is a profound tragedy. In parts of the world where HCQ is used quite prolifically, like India and Africa, the main use of hydroxychloroquine is an anti-malarial drug. So it's used quite widely in India and in Africa. And interestingly, in both of those, in the continent of Africa, subcontinent of India, had much lower death rates, significantly lower death rates from COVID-19, quite unexpectedly so in the case of Africa and India. Much lower death rates than the West did. And you can point to a lot of reasons for that. One reason that makes sense, frankly, I can't prove it, would be the widespread use of HCQ in patients that were suffering from COVID. So all of this vindicates Donald Trump's approach, but really you have to look back and say the real motivation for this horrible study being posted in Lancet, being published by Lancet, was just a hatred of Donald Trump and a desire to do the opposite of whatever he said.
Okay, Frank, you have put together now a list how the Democrats are just lovers of truth. Go.
Well, in just about every range of areas that have been hot topics over the past decade or so, we've seen instances of Democrat, frankly, lying and coming up with false studies. Let's talk about climate change, which is a big part of the Democrat and left-wing push. One of the most famous studies, indeed some say the anchor study of climate change, was a research report by East Anglia University in the UK. As it turns out, that study was falsified, used falsified data. It's been totally debunked, yet it's still used as a absolute pivotal point in the discussion on climate change. Ben brought up the discussion on HCl, I won't mispronounce it. We look at defense issues where the Democrats continue to obscure the inherent immediate danger from China, from Russia, from Iran. We look at the last election where the Democrat media intentionally ignored facts in order to boost the Biden presidency. All in all, it's a portrayal of a particular part of the American political scene, basing everything it does on false studies and outright lies.
We have just touched the surface, and Frank wanted to continue. We got to cut him off right now, and then we're going to talk more about what he was just talking about as well with the climate accords in Paris. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.